On a humid afternoon in early June, when the sun outside the terminal windows blazed against the glass panels of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport and heat shimmered off the runways in visible waves, a tall black woman named Monica Harris carried herself with a calm dignity that belied the heavy stares and whispers trailing her through the busy concourse, her long legs wrapped in tailored navy trousers that swayed lightly with each step, her white silk blouse tucked neatly, her jet black hair tied into a low bun that highlighted the striking angles of her face. The high cheekbones inherited from her late mother, and the steady, determined eyes of someone who had endured more dismissals and humiliations than she cared to count, but who carried them now as silent fuel. Monica was 42 years old, 5'9", with smooth brown skin that glowed under the artificial airport lighting, and though she walked quietly, there was an aura about her, of restrained strength, of patience stretched to its final thread, that made her presence felt even in the bustling chaos of the terminal. Yet on this particular afternoon, she was not the CEO of a holding company or the silent owner of multiple aviation assets, but just another passenger, ticket in hand, waiting to board a flight. She technically did not need to take because she owned the aircraft itself, though no one in that line knew it. Not the businessman checking his Rolex impatiently, not the young mother soothing her crying infant, and certainly not the flight attendant named Carol Whitmore, a woman in her 30s, early 30s with sharp features, thin lips painted a severe red, blonde hair pulled tightly into a bun that made her pale forehead shine under the cabin lights, her uniform pressed to military perfection, her shoulders squared with a pride that had long since soured into arrogance, her green eyes quick to judge, and her tongue quicker still, for Carol had cultivated a reputation among her colleagues for treating passengers with disdain if they did not meet her invisible standards. Though management had overlooked the complaints because her efficiency record was spotless, and because she smiled for her superiors with a sincerity she never spared for those under her watch. Carol was standing at the boarding gate scanning passes when Monica stepped forward, and though Monica's ticket showed first-class seating, Carol's eyes flicked over the name, the boarding group, and then lingered on Monica's skin tone, her brows twitching in barely concealed irritation, as if she had seen this scene too many times before, and each time felt justified in asserting some unspoken order. And with a voice pitched loud enough for the passengers behind Monica to hear, she said, "Excuse me, ma'am, you're in the wrong line. Economy is boarding later." Her lips curling as if expecting embarrassment. But Monica, who had heard variations of that same dismissal at restaurants, banks, and hotels all her life, simply tilted her head slightly, met Carol's stare with eyes that gave away neither anger nor submission, and answered in a voice deep, warm, and deliberate, "No, this is my line, and this is my ticket," handing the printed slip with an unshaken hand, which Carol snatched, glanced at, and with a flicker of surprise saw the bold black print. First Class 1E. But instead of softening, she hardened, snapping the stub back toward Monica, muttering, "Must have been a mistake," before waving the next passenger forward as if to brush Monica aside. Yet Monica did not move, and the line stalled, murmurs rising, some passengers frowning at the delay, others smirking as though entertained by the tension. And in that moment, a man stepped closer from behind Monica. A white executive in a grey suit with thinning hair and an expensive cologne, smirking as he said, "She probably used miles. These days they'll let anyone up front." A remark that triggered soft laughter from two young men in polo shirts nearby. And though Monica's jaw tightened, she said nothing, only walked calmly past the gate into the jet bridge as Carol shouted after her, "You can't just push your way in. Security will hear about this." The narrow corridor funneled Monica into the cabin where cool air brushed against her cheeks, and she found her seat easily. 1A, wide leather cushions, polished armrests, the scent of disinfectant still lingering from the quick turnover. But when she sat, she noticed Carol storming in behind her, cheeks flushed, eyes flashing, and leaning close to hiss, "Move out immediately. You don't belong here." a sentence sharpened with venom that sliced through the hushed conversations of nearby passengers, drawing stares and gasps. And before Monica could even form a reply, Carol's hand, trembling with the adrenaline of unchecked authority, darted forward and struck Monica across the shoulder with a flat, dismissive shove. Not a full slap, but enough to jolt her body against the armrest. The sound of contact ringing in the stunned silence of first class. And for one heavy second, the entire cabin froze. The businessman in 2C dropping his newspaper, the flight attendant in the galley stiffening mid-step, a young girl clutching her mother's sleeve with wide eyes, and Carol herself realizing too late that her hand had crossed a line she could not retreat from. Yet even then, she straightened as if to double down, as if righteousness would shield her, saying, "I said move." But Monica rose slowly, fluidly, her tall frame towering now, her calm composure unbroken, though her dark eyes gleamed with the fire of someone tired of shrinking. And from her leather handbag, she withdrew a slim, well-worn folder, bound in deep brown, its edges gilded faintly with gold, the kind of folder used for official deeds and contracts. And when she opened it with precise fingers and laid the first page across the polished surface of the seatback table, the passengers closest to her craned their necks and read words that should never have appeared in that context. Aircraft ownership deed, notarized, signed, sealed, naming Monica Harris as sole proprietor of the very plane they sat in, and the silence broke into a collective gasp, whispers rising like wind through a canyon. And Carol's jaw slackened, her posture faltering as though the floor beneath her had tilted, because in that moment her authority crumbled, her role inverted, and she, the enforcer of order, found herself trespassing in the kingdom of the very woman she had dismissed. Yet Monica did not gloat, did not raise her voice. She only said, in that same measured, resonant tone, "I don't need to move. This plane belongs to me." Words that traveled like shockwaves through the cabin, reshaping the scene into legend even as it unfolded, and though the flight would eventually depart, though investigations and headlines would follow, what happened in that first hour, the confrontation, the strike, the deed, was the genesis of a story far larger, one that reached back into Monica's childhood in Birmingham, Alabama, where she had learned to hold her chin high in the face of jeers, through the years of study at Howard University, where she excelled in finance despite professors doubting her resolve, through the long nights building Harris Aviation Holdings from a borrowed office with peeling wallpaper and a single-used laptop, through the heartbreak of losing her mother to illness just as her first fleet contract was signed, through betrayals by partners and dismissals by investors, each scar layering into the woman who now stood on this plane, unshaken by slaps or sneers, carrying not just a deed, but a lifetime of proof that she belonged anywhere she chose. And as the murmurs swelled into open astonishment, a boy no older than 10 in seat 1C whispered to his father, "Dad, she owns the plane," his voice tinged with awe. And the father, a balding accountant with tired eyes, nodded slowly, as though realizing he was witnessing a moment his son would recount for decades. While Carol, pale now beneath her makeup, stepped back, searching for words that would not come, her hands trembling as the other crew members approached, uncertain whether to shield her or distance themselves, and Monica, smoothing the folder shut, sat again with serene finality, her presence filling the space not just as a passenger, but as the owner, the pioneer, the woman who had endured the weight of prejudice only to rise above it with the ultimate irony. Authority so unquestionable, it left her oppressors speechless. And thus the journey began. Not only the flight to New York, but the story that would echo across boardrooms, newsrooms, and living rooms. A story about power, dignity, and the cost of underestimating the quiet strength of a woman who refused to be moved. The days that followed the dramatic confrontation aboard the aircraft became a whirlwind that Monica Harris had long anticipated yet never fully prepared for. Because while she had always known that one day her ownership of Harris Aviation Holdings would become public knowledge, she had not expected it to be revealed in such a raw human moment, with a slap still stinging on her shoulder and passengers gasping in shock. But the universe, as it often had in her life, chose its own timing, and the story spread faster than any press release or media strategy could have engineered. By the time the plane touched down in New York that evening, whispers had already reached other terminals, and by morning, social media feeds were ablaze with clips, shaky phone videos, and hastily written posts describing the woman who owned the plane she was slapped on. A phrase repeated endlessly until it became a symbol of poetic justice. And while some online skeptics doubted its authenticity, calling it staged or exaggerated, the notarized deed, photographed by one passenger with a keen eye for detail, circulated widely enough to silence most doubts. And suddenly, Monica Harris, who had spent years quietly building her empire away from the spotlight, was thrust into it with blinding intensity. Yet before she could face the cameras, the microphones, and the debates, she found herself haunted by the faces of those who had witnessed it firsthand. The young boy in 1C, whose wide-eyed awe reminded her of herself at his age, sitting cross-legged on the worn carpet of her childhood home in Birmingham, as her mother, Gloria Harris, a woman of modest height, with thick arms from years of factory work, caramel brown skin glistening with sweat from double shifts, and eyes that glowed with both exhaustion and unbreakable love, would tell her, "Baby, they'll tell you where you can't sit, where you don't belong, but you never listen unless it's God himself talking." Words that became Monica's silent mantra in classrooms where she was the only black girl in advanced math, in offices where male colleagues questioned her spreadsheets, in boardrooms where investors mistook her assistant for the CEO, and remembering her mother now filled her chest with both pain and pride. In the quiet of her Manhattan apartment, walls lined with abstract art she had collected during business trips to Ghana and South Africa, she poured herself a glass of red wine and sat by the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city, the neon glow below flickering like restless fireflies, and allowed herself to recall not only her mother, but also her father, Henry Harris, a stern but loving man who had once been a mechanic at a small regional airline, his hands permanently marked with grease no soap could wash away, his back bent from years of lifting heavy tools, but whose eyes sparkled whenever he spoke about the marvel of flight, how a machine heavier than houses could lift itself into the sky. And though Henry had passed away from a heart attack when Monica was only 17, the memory of him leaning over a half-disassembled engine, explaining to her how turbines worked while she handed him wrenches with hands still too small to grip properly, never left her. And it was perhaps his influence more than anything that had steered her toward aviation when her peers pursued law, medicine, or finance. The irony that she had built an aviation empire yet still been told to move out of her own first-class seat was not lost on her. And as she swirled the wine in her glass, she thought about Carol Whitmore, the flight attendant, whose arrogance had sparked this entire storm. And she wondered whether Carol was losing sleep, whether she understood the gravity of what she had done, not merely assaulting a passenger, but attempting to erase her dignity in front of dozens. And Monica, though not vindictive by nature, knew that there would be consequences, not only because she herself had the resources to press charges, but because the world had seen it, and the airline executives, already calling her phone with frantic apologies, were scrambling to contain what had grown beyond their control. Yet, Chapter 2 of Monica's journey was not just about fallout and apologies, but about the deeper currents of her past that explained why she had handled that moment with such stillness, why she had not screamed, not struck back, not raised her voice. Because Monica Harris was not a woman who reacted impulsively. She was a woman sculpted by years of navigating hostility with grace sharpened into steel, and to understand that one had to journey back with her into her college years at Howard University, where she arrived at 18, her hair braided neatly by her mother the night before she left, her suitcase second-hand, her scholarship partial, her heart pounding with fear and hope. Howard, with its red brick buildings and tree-lined paths, was a sanctuary of black excellence. Yet even there Monica found herself both uplifted and tested, for in the halls of finance and economics she encountered professors who praised her brilliance, but peers who doubted her ambition. Young men who whispered that she was too serious, too cold, too unwilling to flirt her way into networks. Yet Monica held firm, burying herself in textbooks, balancing part-time jobs at the library and tutoring centers, and slowly building a reputation as someone who not only mastered balance sheets, but who could also inspire others with her quiet confidence. One of those inspired was her roommate, Danielle Brooks, a petite woman with curly auburn hair and a laugh that filled dorm hallways, who would become her lifelong friend, the sister she chose, and who would later remind her, in moments of doubt, that her strength had always been her refusal to be defined by anyone else's narrow lens. Danielle, now a civil rights attorney, was one of the first to call after the incident, her voice crackling through the phone, half outraged, half proud, saying, "Girl, you just rewrote the playbook. They'll study this moment for years." Words that made Monica smile, despite the weight pressing on her chest, because she knew Danielle was right. This was bigger than her, bigger than Carol, bigger than the airline. It was about every time a person had been told to move when they had every right to stay, every time dignity had been brushed aside as inconvenience, every time silence had been forced where truth wanted to speak. So in Chapter 2, Monica resolved that she would not retreat into the shadows. She would not issue a carefully crafted statement through publicists and let the story fade. No, she would face it head on, not for vengeance, but for clarity, for justice, for her mother's words and her father's hands, for that boy in 1C who needed to see that standing your ground was not just possible, but powerful. And thus, as the city slept outside her window, Monica Harris made a decision that would shape the next chapters of her life. She would tell her story, fully, truthfully, unflinchingly, no matter how many doors it rattled or powers it unsettled, because silence had never protected her. But her voice, her steady, deliberate voice, just might protect others. The media firestorm that erupted after Monica Harris's quiet revelation on the plane did not fade with the next news cycle as so many viral stories did. Instead, it grew, fed by the flames of debate across television panels, podcasts, and social networks where hashtags like "She owns the plane" and "Move out immediately" trended for weeks, each comment thread becoming a battleground of disbelief, admiration, resentment, and inspiration. And while Monica had once dreaded visibility, fearing that public attention would distract her from the precise calculations and negotiations her business demanded, she now understood that the moment had chosen her, not the other way around. And so she braced herself as cameras gathered outside her Manhattan office building. Journalists shouting questions that ranged from sympathetic curiosity to barely veiled hostility. Their lenses capturing every flicker of her expression, every outfit she wore, every silence she allowed to hang in the air. Yet, behind the headlines and noise, Monica was still a woman carrying private battles, memories, and relationships. One of which was with her younger brother, Marcus Harris, a man in his late 30s, 5'11", broad-shouldered with a neatly trimmed beard peppered with grey, eyes darker than Monica's and lined with years of labour, his hands rough from construction work. And though he had once dreamed of becoming an architect, life's demands had kept him on job sites instead of design studios. But Marcus had never resented Monica for her soaring path. He admired her fiercely, sometimes protectively, and when the incident reached him through a viral clip shared by a co-worker during lunch break, he threw down his sandwich, muttered, "That's my sister," and spent the rest of the shift consumed by anger and pride. Anger that someone had dared strike her. Pride that she had handled it with the composure of a queen. That evening he called her, his voice rumbling with suppressed emotion. "Sis, you want me to handle something? You just say the word." To which Monica chuckled softly, a sound rare in those tense days, and replied, "No, Marcus, the world is already watching. I don't need fists, I need focus." And though he sighed, she could hear in his silence that he understood, that he trusted her strategy. And so brother and sister leaned on each other through long phone calls, late-night texts, and occasional visits where they would cook their mother's recipes. Fried catfish and collard greens, the food grounding them in the roots of who they were even as the world pulled them into arenas neither had imagined. Meanwhile, the airline itself, a major international carrier whose executives had for years cultivated an image of inclusivity and excellence, scrambled to contain the fallout, their headquarters buzzing with emergency meetings where men in suits loosened their ties and women in blazers tapped furiously at laptops, drafting apologies, considering settlements, and whispering about Carol Whitmore, whose once pristine personnel file now seemed like a ticking time bomb, and Carol herself, holed up in her modest apartment in Queens, curtains drawn, found her phone flooded with voicemails ranging from threats to sympathy, her face splashed across tabloids as the attendant who slapped the owner. And though she tried to defend herself to friends, claiming she had been provoked, insisting she had acted to protect order, deep down she knew her career was unraveling, thread by thread, and for the first time in years she confronted the ugliness of her own biases. The way she had allowed resentment to calcify into cruelty, though whether that reckoning would soften her or harden her further remained uncertain. Back in Monica's world, her closest allies urged her to seize the momentum, to turn the public outrage into a platform for change. And none urged her louder than Danielle Brooks, the friend who had shared dorm room secrets and study sessions decades earlier, now a respected civil rights attorney, known for her fiery closing arguments, her slender frame often wrapped in tailored suits of bold colors, her hair cut into a stylish bob, and her presence in a courtroom commanding in ways that belied her petite stature. And Danielle, over coffee in Monica's office, leaned forward, tapping manicured nails against the table, and said, "Monica, this isn't just about you. It's about everyone who's ever been told to move. You need to speak. You need to testify. Not just in court if it comes to that, but in the court of public opinion." And Monica, sipping her espresso slowly, replied, "Danielle, I've built my life on numbers, contracts, not speeches. I don't know if I'm the one they should be listening to." But Danielle shook her head fiercely, her eyes blazing. "That's exactly why you're the one. They'll listen because you've lived it, because you don't dramatize, you endure, and people trust endurance more than theatrics." And though Monica remained hesitant, she felt the truth of Danielle's words burrowing into her chest. The following week, she received an invitation to appear on a primetime talk show hosted by Ellen Porter, a veteran journalist with salt and pepper hair cut short, glasses perched low on her nose, her reputation built on fairness and sharp questioning. And Monica debated for days whether to accept, pacing her office late into the night, staring at the skyline while her assistant, Rafael Dominguez, a meticulous young man of 28 with olive skin, neatly combed dark hair, and a habit of carrying multiple notepads filled with reminders, urged her gently, "Ms. Harris, the longer you wait, the more others will shape the story for you." And finally, Monica agreed. The night of the interview, she wore a charcoal grey suit tailored to perfection, minimal jewelry save for a gold bracelet that had belonged to her mother. And when she sat under the bright studio lights facing Ellen Porter, the nation leaned closer to their screens, some eager to see arrogance exposed, others hungry for inspiration. And Monica, with that same deliberate calm she had shown on the plane, recounted the incident, but not with bitterness. She spoke of her parents, her journey, her belief in dignity, her refusal to let humiliation define her. And she held up the deed once again, its brown leather folder glowing under the lights, not as a weapon, but as a symbol, saying, "Ownership isn't just about property, it's about owning your worth, even when others try to strip it away." And the studio fell silent before erupting in applause. The clip later replayed millions of times, translated into memes, quoted in classrooms, etched into protest signs. And as Monica left the studio that night, walking into the cool Manhattan air, she realized that the story had outgrown her. It was now part of something collective, a movement she had not planned, but which she could no longer ignore. And though the road ahead promised backlash, lawsuits, and perhaps danger, she felt for the first time not just the weight of her past, but the wings of her future. And with them, she prepared to soar higher than ever. The aftermath of Monica Harris's television appearance reshaped not only her personal trajectory, but also the public conversation about race, ownership, and dignity in ways that rippled far beyond airports and airlines. For while many applauded her composure and saw her as a symbol of resilience, others bristled, their resentment boiling over in talk radio rants, online forums, and dinner table arguments where skeptics sneered that she had flaunted wealth to humiliate a working-class attendant, ignoring the years of labor that had forged her authority. But Monica had learned long ago that visibility invited resistance as much as admiration, and she refused to be distracted, focusing instead on the work that awaited her. Because Harris Aviation Holdings, the company she had painstakingly built from modest beginnings, was on the verge of a transformative merger with an international cargo airline, a deal that would expand her fleet and establish her as one of the most powerful figures in private aviation. Yet behind every contract lay human stories, and in Monica's case, those stories included her leadership team, a circle of individuals who had grown with her through setbacks and triumphs. Among them, Rafael Dominguez, her diligent assistant who had recently been promoted to operations manager, his confidence blossoming under her mentorship, and Clara Mitchell, a tall woman in her mid-50s with silver-streaked hair cut to her shoulders, her deep-set hazel eyes often softened by glasses, her laugh hearty, but her business acumen razor-sharp, who had once been Monica's fiercest critic during a negotiation, but later became her trusted chief financial officer after Monica proved her integrity in a deal that could have gone sour. And Clara, widowed for nearly a decade, had found renewed purpose in Harris Aviation, pouring her energy into spreadsheets, forecasts, and late-night strategy calls, treating Monica not just as a boss, but as a surrogate daughter. Together, this team now faced the challenges of managing both a growing empire and the media frenzy. And while Clara often counseled restraint, "Let the story burn out, Monica, and we'll focus on numbers," Raphael argued for harnessing the momentum, urging her to create scholarships, to launch community initiatives under the banner of her newfound visibility. And Monica, torn between pragmatism and responsibility, spent sleepless nights weighing the paths, her mind drifting often to her late father, Henry, who would have reminded her that flight was always about balance, lift and weight, thrust and drag. And perhaps her life was no different. During these restless nights, she also revisited memories of betrayal that had once scarred her, none deeper than that of Leonard Price, a former business partner from her early days who, tall and square-jawed with neatly combed brown hair and a salesman's smile, had charmed her into trusting him with joint investments only to siphon funds and leave her drowning in debt, an act that forced her to rebuild from the ashes with nothing but grit and a handful of loyal allies. And though Leonard had since disappeared into obscurity, rumors suggested he now worked quietly for a rival aviation firm, and the thought of him watching her rise, perhaps gnashing his teeth in envy, brought Monica a cold satisfaction. Yet her greatest challenges in Chapter 4 were not old betrayals, but new assaults from corners of society she had never directly confronted. For soon after her television appearance, she began receiving threatening letters, anonymous emails laced with venom, messages warning her to stay in her lane or face consequences. And while her security detail, headed by James Holloway, a former Secret Service agent in his 50s, tall with a shaved head, piercing blue eyes, and a no-nonsense demeanor, assured her that much of it was bluster, Monica could not ignore the unease that crept into her bones each time she stepped into a car or walked into a crowded building. And though she outwardly projected serenity, in private, she prayed for strength, clutching the gold bracelet of her mother as though it were a talisman against hatred. Meanwhile, Carol Whitmore, the attendant whose slap had ignited the fire, re-emerged in interviews of her own, appearing on sympathetic platforms where she tearfully claimed victimhood, painting herself as overwhelmed and unfairly vilified, her once neat blonde bun now replaced by loose, tired hair, her complexion pale from stress, and though some audiences pitied her, others saw through the performance, flooding comment sections with scathing rebukes. And Monica, watching one such interview late at night, felt no triumph, only pity for a woman who had mistaken cruelty for control and now sought refuge in lies. And yet Monica also understood that public sympathy was fickle, that Carol's narrative could sway opinion if left unchallenged, and so she began preparing not only for business negotiations, but also for the broader battle of truth, one that would require stamina, clarity, and allies. One such ally emerged unexpectedly in the form of Senator Richard Caldwell, a tall, silver-haired politician in his early 60s with a reputation for bipartisanship and a commanding baritone voice that resonated even in crowded town halls, who reached out to Monica after reading about her ordeal, inviting her to testify at a congressional hearing on workplace discrimination and systemic bias. And though Monica hesitated, aware that stepping into political arenas could tether her story to agendas she did not control, she also recognized the opportunity to turn personal pain into institutional change. And after long discussions with Danielle Brooks, who reminded her that silence protects no one, Monica agreed. The day of the hearing, dressed in a navy suit that matched the flag behind her, Monica sat before a panel of lawmakers, cameras whirring, her voice steady as she recounted not only the incident on the plane, but the long history of subtle and overt dismissals she had faced in boardrooms and airports alike. Her testimony punctuated by stories of her father's grease-stained hands and her mother's words of resilience. And though some lawmakers pressed her with skeptical questions, attempting to frame her experience as isolated, her calm responses dismantled their doubt. And when she finished, the room erupted in quiet applause from the audience, her words already destined to be quoted in op-eds and policy briefs. Yet beneath all the noise, Monica remained focused on the core of her journey: to live with dignity, to honor her parents, to protect her company, and to guide her brother Marcus, her friend Danielle, and her loyal team toward a future where ownership was not merely about assets, but about narrative, about refusing to be erased. And as Chapter 4 closed, Monica stood on the balcony of her office building, the city lights shimmering like stars below, the cool night wind lifting strands of her hair, and she whispered into the darkness, not to the cameras or crowds, but to herself, "I will not be moved." A vow that echoed in her heart like the steady hum of an aircraft engine preparing for takeoff, carrying her toward battles still unseen but inevitable, battles she was now ready to face. In the weeks after her testimony before Congress, Monica Harris found herself at the center of a whirlwind that tested her stamina, her resolve, and her very sense of self. For while the applause from that chamber still echoed in her ears, the pushback that followed was swift and merciless. Driven by factions of media pundits who accused her of exploiting an incident for personal gain, by rival business interests who whispered doubts about her leadership, and by those anonymous shadows who filled her inbox with threats that grew bolder by the day. Yet Monica, though weary, pressed on, reminding herself of the faces who depended on her. The employees of Harris Aviation who saw her as proof that grit could build empires. The students who now wrote to her, asking for advice on breaking into industries that had always shut them out. The communities that looked at her and saw possibility. And most of all, her brother Marcus, who never stopped calling to ask, "You eating? You sleeping? You fighting smart?" Still, Monica was human, and in her quieter moments, she wrestled with loneliness, staring at the vast Manhattan skyline through her apartment windows at night, wondering whether her late parents would have approved of the path she had taken, whether her mother's bracelet glinting on her wrist was a reminder of victory or of burdens she never asked to carry. And during one such night of doubt, she was interrupted by a phone call from Clara Mitchell, her CFO, who rarely called after midnight unless the matter was urgent. And Clara's voice, normally steady, carried an edge of tension as she explained that Leonard Price, the former partner who had once betrayed Monica and disappeared into obscurity, had resurfaced with bold intent, representing a rival firm attempting to derail the merger Monica had been negotiating for months, a deal that would triple her fleet capacity and cement her company as a global force. Hearing Leonard's name again was like tasting old poison, for she remembered vividly the night years ago when she discovered he had drained accounts they were supposed to safeguard together, his grin vanishing into the darkness as he fled, leaving her to face debts and creditors alone. And though she had rebuilt stronger, scars remained, and now the idea of him plotting against her once more sent a cold fury coursing through her veins. But Monica, disciplined as always, did not lash out. She strategized, assembling her team, poring over documents late into the night, rehearsing counter-arguments and preparing for the confrontation she knew was inevitable. When the day of the merger hearing arrived, held in a sleek boardroom on the 40th floor of a midtown tower, Monica entered in a black suit, sharp as a blade, her posture straight, her expression serene, and across the long mahogany table sat Leonard Price, still tall and square-jawed, his brown hair now streaked with grey. His once charming smile sharpened into something colder, and he looked at her with a mixture of disdain and begrudging respect, saying in a voice dripping with condescension, "Well, Monica, you've come a long way from that little office with peeling wallpaper." To which she replied, without missing a beat, "Yes, Leonard, and I came here without stealing what wasn't mine." A sentence that silenced the room for a heartbeat before the negotiations began in earnest. Voices rising and falling as lawyers, financiers, and executives debated figures and clauses. And though Leonard attempted to paint her as unstable, citing the media frenzy, Monica countered with data, projections, and the iron discipline of her preparation. And when she produced letters of intent from international partners eager to work with her, the tide turned visibly and Leonard's smugness faltered, replaced by a clenched jaw as he realized his sabotage was failing. Yet even as Monica triumphed in the room, she knew the battle was not only about contracts, but about narratives. For Leonard and his allies would continue whispering, planting doubts, stirring storms. And so she resolved that victory required not only sharp business moves but also public trust. A trust she could build by investing in people, by turning her newfound visibility into tangible change. That night, after the merger was secured with signatures inked on heavy paper, Monica celebrated not with champagne, but with a quiet dinner at Marcus's modest home in Brooklyn, where his children, 10-year-old Ethan, lanky and curious with wide brown eyes, and 7-year-old Naomi, petite with tight curls and a mischievous grin, climbed onto her lap, peppering her with questions about airplanes and television, their innocence reminding her why she fought so fiercely, and over plates of macaroni and cheese. Monica laughed, the sound surprising even herself, for it had been too long since she allowed joy to rise above vigilance. Later, as she walked to her car under the night sky, Marcus pulled her into a hug, his beard brushing her cheek, his voice low with both pride and warning. "You're winning battles, sis, but wars are long. Don't let them break you." And she promised she wouldn't, though she knew deep down that wars always exacted costs, some visible, some hidden. And as she drove back to Manhattan with city lights shimmering in the distance, she whispered again to the night, "I will not be moved," a vow now heavier than ever. For Chapter 5 was not just about contracts and rivals, it was about resilience in the face of relentless storms. Storms that would only intensify as her influence grew. Storms she had no choice but to endure with the grace, fire, and unyielding spirit that had carried her this far. The final chapter of Monica Harris's journey in this tumultuous season of her life unfolded not with the quiet dignity of a single decisive moment, but with the roaring complexity of overlapping battles that tested every fiber of her resolve. For while the ink on the merger contract was barely dry and her company's expansion was celebrated in financial journals across the globe, the forces arrayed against her only grew more determined, manifesting as smear campaigns in tabloid headlines that questioned her character, as subtle sabotage attempts against her business deals, and as the ever-present shadow of Leonard Price, who, though defeated in the boardroom, prowled the edges of her success like a wounded predator, searching for weakness. Yet Monica, far from cowed, recognized that true power was measured not in victories alone, but in endurance, and she set about fortifying every corner of her world, strengthening her company's infrastructure, deepening her bonds with allies like Clara Mitchell, whose hazel eyes now glimmered with maternal pride each time Monica entered a room, guiding Rafael Dominguez, whose tireless dedication made him a rising star within the company, and leaning on Danielle Brooks, who became her public voice in legal and civil rights arenas, fiery and eloquent in ways Monica's measured tones could never be. And together, they formed not merely a leadership team, but a family forged by trust, shared scars, and mutual ambition. Still, Monica knew that leadership came with solitude, and in her rare quiet moments, she sought solace in walks through Central Park at dawn, the cool morning mist brushing her skin, her mind wandering to her parents and their enduring presence within her, to her brother Marcus, whose protective love grounded her, to his children, Ethan and Naomi, whose laughter reminded her that the future was not just contracts and headlines, but the innocence of tomorrow. As the months rolled forward, the airline industry itself shifted under the weight of Monica's visibility, with smaller carriers reaching out to her for partnerships, advocacy groups inviting her to speak at conferences, and universities requesting her presence to inspire the next generation of aviators. And though she accepted some invitations and declined others, she realized that she was no longer merely a CEO. She had become a symbol, a reality both empowering and exhausting. For while symbols inspire, they also attract endless scrutiny, and Monica was forced to confront her own vulnerability when, one evening, leaving her office, she was nearly shoved into oncoming traffic by a man who fled before security could catch him. The incident rattling her enough that James Holloway, her head of security, insisted on expanding her protection detail. His piercing blue eyes filled with both professional concern and personal respect as he told her, "Ma'am, enemies don't rest, so neither can we." And though Monica nodded, she quietly prayed that the battle would not consume her spirit. Yet light pierced through the darkness in unexpected ways, one of which arrived in the form of an invitation to deliver the keynote speech at an international aviation summit in Geneva, a stage she had once only dreamed of. And though part of her hesitated, fearing further exposure, another part recognized that this was the culmination of her father's grease-stained lessons and her mother's whispered encouragements. And so she accepted. The night before the speech, seated in her hotel room overlooking Lake Geneva, Monica wrote longhand in a leather notebook, her thoughts flowing as memories braided with vision, recalling her first fascination with airplanes, the sting of countless dismissals, the humiliation on that fateful flight, and the triumph of pulling out the deed. And when she stepped onto the summit stage the next morning, dressed in a cream-colored suit that radiated quiet authority, her tall frame silhouetted against a backdrop of flags from around the world, the room hushed to hear her, and she spoke not of contracts or mergers, but of dignity, of resilience, of the belief that ownership begins with the refusal to let others dictate your worth. And her words, simple yet steady, resonated so deeply that even hardened executives found themselves blinking back tears, while students and young professionals in the audience rose to their feet in ovation. The speech was broadcast live, replayed across continents, and in that moment, Monica's story ceased to be a scandal or a headline. It became a movement, a call to hold ground with grace, to own space unapologetically, to rise without permission. And yet, even as the world applauded, Monica remained acutely aware that battles never truly end. For as long as prejudice and arrogance existed, there would be another Carol Whitmore ready to strike, another Leonard Price ready to scheme, another faceless voice ready to sneer. But she also knew, perhaps more clearly than ever, that she was not alone, that she carried her parents' spirits, her brother's devotion, her team's loyalty, her friends' fire, and the wide-eyed hope of every young boy or girl who whispered, "She owns the plane," and believed it meant that they too could own their destiny. Thus, as she flew home from Geneva, seated once again in 1A, the leather folder containing the deed resting quietly in her bag, Monica gazed out the oval window at the clouds beneath her, the sun igniting the horizon in golden fire, and whispered a final vow. "I will never move for anyone who tries to erase me." Her voice steady, her spirit unbroken, her journey far from over, but her place in history already secured. For Monica Harris, the woman once told to move out of her own seat, had proven that sometimes the most powerful act of defiance is simply to stay, and in staying, to soar.